Because schizophrenia and autism are neurodevelopmental disorders, that's why I have smushed them together with this topic of plasticity and how the brain changes in response to certain developmental conditions, because we're going to talk about the types of conditions and vulnerabilities that cause disorders like schizophrenia or autism to develop. So we're going to start with schizophrenia and talk about the symptoms, the possible causes or risk factors, and then this neurodevelopmental hypothesis about how it comes about, and then talk about treatments. Schizophrenia has 3 clusters of symptoms. And these words can be kind of confusing if you have not studied this before. All the symptoms can be unpleasant for people, okay? So when we say positive or negative or cognitive, the 3 types, that doesn't have to do with whether they feel good or bad. It has to do with whether something is added or taken away compared to typical experience. Negative symptoms means that there's something taken away compared to typical experience. Emotional expression tends to be reduced, and we call this flat affect. People tend to withdraw socially, and they tend to have anhedonia. And remember, hedonism is like doing whatever feels good. So anhedonia, from those root words, means not enjoying anything anymore. And that's a common depressive symptom too. So these negative symptoms actually look a lot like depression. You're not showing any feelings, you're not talking to anybody, and you're not enjoying anything anymore. Positive symptoms, on the other hand, are not, again, considered something enjoyable necessarily. They are something added compared to typical experience. These are hallucinations, delusions, and disorganized speech. Now, many people with schizophrenia will tell you that their hallucinations and delusions are experiences and beliefs. Everybody has experiences and beliefs, and they are all in our brains and all in our minds. We talked about at the very beginning of this class in week 1 that perception is all in your brain, and we're all going to have slightly different ones, and none of them actually match up with reality perfectly, okay? So the thing with these hallucinations or experiences and delusions or beliefs is that they are just unusual hallucinations and delusions. Everybody might sometimes see things or hear things that are not necessarily there, but people with schizophrenia tend to see and hear things that everybody else around them does not, okay? And delusions as well. They tend to have unusual beliefs, sort of like conspiracy theories and those types of things, unusual beliefs about receiving messages, hidden coded messages, or having paranoid beliefs that people are out to get them in some way. Another hallmark is disorganized speech. So the reasoning and thought process of people with schizophrenia tends to be different than average. It is not necessarily a wrong way of reasoning, but it is going to make less sense to other people. It kind of makes sense only to them. And then there's cognitive symptoms, which have to do with that thinking process. It's not always going to follow the rules of logic, but they're going to be reasoning in a different way. Their attention tends to be different. Eye movements tend to be different as well than average, and they tend to have some memory issues because of these attentional differences. They're going to be paying attention to different things in their environment than everyone else does, probably because of their beliefs and experiences about it. There are different risk factors. So if somebody has one of these risk factors, it doesn't mean they will develop schizophrenia. It just means that they're more likely to. Genetic risk factors include polygenic and heterogeneous effects, meaning kind of like our eye color example back in our Punnett squares. There's not just one gene for eye color, remember? I said there's more like 10, and it's a combination of them, but we were just looking at something oversimplified for the purposes of studying genetics. So in schizophrenia, that's also what we have. There's no single gene that seems to cause it. There are many, many different types of genes that have been identified, and it's a heterogeneous disorder, meaning that somebody with one cluster of genetic mutations might have schizophrenia, but somebody with the same symptoms might have a completely different cluster of genetic mutations that cause the same thing or contributed to or put them at risk for the same symptoms. Interestingly, though, people with schizophrenia tend to have half as many children as the neurotypical population. Because of this, it seems like the genetic risk factors wouldn't get passed on that much. But what that shows us is that it's possibly a genetic mutation or a series of genetic mutations that keep popping up fresh instead of being passed down through many generations. But it does tend to run in families, however. One of the genes that's been identified has something to do with neural migration. So remember back to our development unit about the life cycle of a neuron. Remember that neurons are created through proliferation, and then they differentiate into being a neuron, and then they migrate. They follow chemical signals and travel where they are meant to go to function typically. Genes that code for neurons being created and also migrating tend to be different in people with schizophrenia, and this may have something to do with explaining some of their symptoms. Neurons are ending up in different destinations than they are in other people, and that can explain some of the symptoms that we see. Environmental factors do put people at risk as well, though. There's strong genetic components, but also strong environmental ones. Things like parasitic infections while in utero, other illnesses while their mother is pregnant and they're still developing, and all kinds of stress can contribute to it. Even births in winter, which tend to put mothers at risk of more infections that can affect the developing fetus. So there's a combination of the genetic and environmental influences. It's a good example of how it's not nature versus nurture, it's nature and nurture combining to create behavioral effects that we see. And that's exactly what the neurodevelopmental hypothesis is designed to explain. This hypothesis helps us to answer why, in the first place, I would be interested in putting this unit alongside neuroplasticity, even though they're way far apart in the textbook. We just covered brain development last week, and this has to do with brain development maybe being put on a different track because of some genetic risk factors and some environmental risk factors that continue to put it down a more schizophrenic path compared to a neurotypical path. People can start with vulnerabilities or those genetic components, but that's not a guarantee that they're going to have some kind of disorder. You may start with some kind of vulnerability, but if you don't encounter a lot of life stressors, that vulnerability may never develop into a full-on disorder. Those stressors are what kind of push you over the finish line of having that disorder. Same goes for schizophrenia. It's that combination of a vulnerability, like those genetic components, and a stressor, like some of those environmental components. Even living in a city versus living in a rural area is one of these stressors that can make a disorder way more likely to develop, that tends to compound over time. One thing that is noted in schizophrenia is people with this disorder have some brain differences compared to people who don't. They have larger ventricles or holes in the middle of their brain that we all have. Theirs tend to be larger. Their frontal lobes tend to have different patterns of blood flow to them as well. And the frontal lobe has to do a lot with reasoning and speech and thought in general. So differences in the development of this frontal lobe may explain why people with schizophrenia have some of those disorganized cognitive symptoms and some of those positive symptoms that we were talking about. If people have genetic and early life vulnerabilities that put them at risk for schizophrenia, how come they don't get schizophrenia until they're like 20? This tends to be because the areas of the brain that maybe contribute to these symptoms aren't even developed yet. So those frontal lobes don't finish developing until young adulthood, and that tends to be when we see schizophrenia get diagnosed. So the neurodevelopmental hypothesis is saying that maybe those early life vulnerabilities have set this development on kind of a different track that's causing those frontal lobes to develop very differently from the typical trajectory. But because that's a very slow developing part of the brain, you may not see a huge difference in behavior until very many years later. Treatments for schizophrenia include antipsychotic medications, which block the signaling of dopamine, and those treat those positive symptoms. Remember the hallucinations or unusual sensory experiences, and those delusions or unusual beliefs, and some of that disorganization in speech and thought. But they do have drawbacks. They do tend to have a lot of side effects that make it difficult for people with the condition to stay on their medications. And they get so much better a lot of times that then they think, oh, I don't need this stuff, I'm fine. And then they may have another relapse into a psychotic episode. So side effects make medication compliance difficult. Other side effects include things like weight gain. And these medications don't treat the negative symptoms like the social withdrawal and flat affect, and they don't treat the cognitive symptoms like the attention and memory. So they're only treating kind of a piece of the puzzle, and they do have some side effects. This is not a disorder that like therapy instead of meds switches out just fine for the most part. Usually talk therapy for schizophrenia helps people stay on their medications and helps them build back their social relationships to help treat some of those negative symptoms. So it's more of helping them cope with the treatments and cope with those symptoms that aren't treated.